What if I told you that there was an airline that threw away its airplanes after just one flight? This company flies a brand new plane from, let's say, San Francisco to New York. It lands, and then they throw it away and buy a new plane for the return flight. Now, this sounds like a pretty awful business model, right? In order to compensate for the ludicrous cost of buying a new plane for each flight, this company would have to charge so much for tickets that pretty much no one could afford to fly. Now, shockingly, this airline is real, and it's still in business. It's called NASA, and for the past 70 years, instead of throwing away airplanes, they've been throwing away rockets. So, to understand where all of your taxpayer dollars are disappearing to, we have to know a little bit about what rockets do and how they work. So, the goal of a rocket is to take some object called a payload, whether that be astronauts or a satellite, and take it to space. The rocket does this by accelerating that object to very fast speeds and very high altitudes, and then it will begin orbiting the Earth. Unfortunately, objects have to be moving really, really fast to orbit the Earth, around 17,000 miles an hour. That's about 4.5 miles a second. If your car went that fast, you could drive from here in San Francisco to Tahoe in around 45 seconds. So, to reach these speeds, rockets use very powerful engines that burn a lot of fuel, very bad gas mileage. So much fuel, in fact, that every rocket needs to allocate more than 90% of its weight budget to fuel alone. That's like having a school bus, but the gas tank is so massive that there's only room for the driver. Because fuel is so heavy, the rest of the rocket needs to stay as light as possible. To do this, as the rocket flies upwards, it actually sheds empty fuel tanks and other components that have become dead weight. Eventually, all of the other parts will fall off the rocket, and only the payload will be left in space. So this means that of our 100% of the rocket, less than 10% of it reaches orbit, and more than 90% of it falls back to Earth and burns up in the atmosphere, destroyed. So to go back to the airplane analogy, our passengers, the payload, reaches its destination, but the airplane, the rocket, gets destroyed after one flight. So this method of basically throwing away the whole rocket has been in use for more than half a century. The Saturn V, the rocket that NASA used to send astronauts to the moon way back in the 60s, is a prime example of how pretty much an entire rocket can be discarded and destroyed throughout the flight. Of this 360-foot tall rocket, only the tiny crew capsule returns to Earth intact. That's that tiny triangle at the very top that the red arrow is pointing to. You can barely see it. It's about 10 feet tall. The Saturn V is also a good starting point if we want to understand how the cost of spaceflight has changed over time. So the Saturn V, until literally this morning, was the largest rocket ever flown. Equally large was its price tag. Adjusted for inflation, each one of these rockets cost a staggering $1.3 billion. Considering how much payload it could carry, that means it costs about $5,000 to put 1 pound of payload into orbit. So, given these hefty price tags, NASA was painfully aware of how expensive it was to throw away each rocket. In fact, Congress canceled several moon missions because they refused to keep funding such a wasteful and expensive endeavor. When the Saturn V was canceled because it was too expensive, NASA built the space shuttle, which was designed to lower the cost of going to space by reusing certain parts of the rocket. NASA engineers did just that. Why don't we make a plane that goes to space? And this space plane, called the Orbiter, carried satellites and astronauts to orbit. And attached to the Orbiter were 2 rocket boosters and a fuel tank. And throughout the flight, those 3 components attached to the Orbiter would fall back to Earth. And while the fuel tank would burn up and be destroyed, as was traditional, the 2 boosters would deploy parachutes and gently, fall down into the ocean where they would be picked up by a boat and refurbished, refilled with fuel, and flown again on a later mission. The orbiter was also meant to be fully reusable. Once it finished its mission in space, it would glide down through the atmosphere and land on a runway like a normal airplane. However, reusing the orbiter wasn't as simple as doing a quick inspection with a flashlight and sending it back to the launch pad. You see, when the orbiter re-entered Earth's atmosphere, it was going at around 25 times the speed of sound, so the outside of the aircraft heated up to more than 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. For reference, a home oven goes up to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit on its highest setting. So it got pretty toasty. To stop the orbiter from completely melting, an array of more than 24,000 uniquely shaped ceramic tiles were used to dissipate the heat. If that sounds complicated and expensive, that's because it was. And these tiles were prone to cracking or even falling off the vehicle entirely. So when it landed, every single one of these tiles needed to be checked, in addition to all the other parts on the spacecraft. And by the way, there were 2.5 million parts on the spacecraft. So they had to basically disassemble the whole thing, inspect it, and reassemble it again. And that was time-intensive and expensive. So it took around 3 months from landing to flying again. So if the shuttle only flew 4 years, 4 times a year, what did NASA initially want it to do? Well, it wanted to fly the shuttle 40 to 60 times a year, so they didn't do great on that either. And as you can see, the price didn't really go down. It actually multiplied by more than 5. So that was kind of an issue as well. But jokes aside, those weren't the only issues with the shuttle. It was notoriously unsafe. Not 1, but 2 catastrophic failures took place, killing 14 astronauts. So while the shuttle did prove it was possible to reuse parts of a rocket, tedious and expensive refurbishment prevented NASA from making space more accessible. But that's not to say the shuttle didn't have any positive impact. It did inspire engineers to build a new reusable rocket that could mitigate the shortcomings of its predecessor. And that rocket is the Falcon 9. Developed by SpaceX, the Falcon 9 is designed to be robust while avoiding the budget-inflating and time-intensive process of refurbishment that plagued the shuttle program. Now, compared to the space shuttle, this looks a bit more conventional. And that might be because there's no spaceflight strapped to it. But what makes the Falcon 9 special is that the bottom 2/3 of the rocket, called the booster, is actually capable of landing itself. And how it does this is that once the booster boosts the top third of the rocket to space, it detaches and starts falling back to Earth. But instead of burning up in the atmosphere and falling into the ocean, it uses fins to maneuver as it falls, and it relights its engines to slow down. And if everything goes to plan, it'll touch down softly on the ground. So because the booster never actually makes it to space, it doesn't need that expensive and damage-prone heat shield. So the process of refurbishing it is much cheaper and faster. And it takes only 9 days to reuse a booster as opposed to 3 months. Falcon 9 has done what the space shuttle could: rapid and reliable reuse at an increasingly affordable price, at only around $1,300 for orbit. So it actually went down this time, which is good. Do notice that only 2/3 of it is reusable. The top third still gets discarded. And SpaceX wants to lower the cost of going to space even further by building a new rocket called Starship, which is fully reusable. If everything works out in the end, they're still in the testing phase, Starship will have a cost of only $5 per pound to orbit, which is definitely a large step down. It kind of goes like this and like that. It's also designed to be flown up to 3 times a day. And it is the largest rocket ever built. And as of 13 hours ago, it is the largest rocket ever flown. And yes, I did wake up at 5:30 to watch the launch. And even though it did explode, it was worth it. To give a quick synopsis, it went really well for the first 4 minutes, and then it didn't. So here you can see it flying, and here you can see it still flying, just in multiple pieces. But for a first test flight, I would say, it went pretty well. There's nothing this big has ever been launched. Now that we understand why going to space has historically been so expensive, and how that's changing at this very moment, what does this mean for you and me? Why does it matter that going to space comes at a cost of $5 per pound instead of $27,000 per pound? So as space becomes cheaper, as going to space becomes cheaper, more and more people can access and take advantage of the final frontier in a way that wasn't possible before. So NASA is actually becoming more and more ambitious with its plans for space exploration. In the next few years, it's going to send astronauts back to the moon for the first time since 1972. It's also planning to build a space station that will orbit the moon and act as a gateway to other planets, like Mars. Just in the same way that cheap spaceflight will enable the exploration of new worlds, the commercial interests in space are also thriving as well. Companies are sending thousands of communication satellites to build a global Wi-Fi network And other companies are sending swarms of imaging satellites to map the surface of the Earth multiple times a day to create a real-time map of how the environment is changing. And while this all sounds great and inspiring, there's also a danger that humanity will restrict access to space and mismanage the resources that lie beyond Earth. This year, 80% of all the mass, of all the cargo, of all the satellites sent to space will fly on a rocket built and operated by SpaceX. And yes, there are other companies that can build rockets, but none of them are quite as capable and have as wide of a reach as SpaceX. So these developments increasingly seem to indicate that SpaceX is securing a monopoly over the space transportation industry. And this could have massive consequences if one private company can dictate who can and who can't go to space in the future. We're at a moment when space is being brought down to Earth like never before. And while it's great to be enthusiastic about this, it's imperative that we don't ignore the dangers of this transition. As more and more satellites are being launched, the area around Earth where satellites orbit is becoming more and more crowded. In fact, astronomers on the ground are complaining that all these satellites are photobombing their photos. These streaks here are from those communication satellites I mentioned earlier, getting in the way of this beautiful shot of a comet. But additionally, as there's more satellites in space, the risk of a collision increases. And remember, the satellites are moving at around 4.5 miles a second. So if two were to hit each other, they would both be pulverized, but the cloud of debris could hit other asteroids, pulverizing them as well, and creating a chain reaction of destruction that could render entire regions of space uninhabitable. In fact, in recent years, the International Space Station has had to perform an increasing number of evasive maneuvers to dodge these pieces of space debris. We also have to consider how humanity will go about exploring new worlds. Will it be an act of exploration and science, or will it be a more commercial venture? And if so, how can we ensure that people responsibly take advantage of these resources? Only time will answer these questions, but I think it's important for everybody to think about not only what space has to offer, but also how we should go about venturing beyond Earth in a way that is both prudent and dignifiable. Thank you.